videotape, record it. So we're going to do that. And let me just introduce myself. I think I know almost everybody. I'm Colleen Feige. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Edina. And we're so happy to have you here today to hear about how Black women are changing politics and influencing elections. We've seen that a lot in the news, and we're going to hear a lot more about it from our guest speaker. That is Duchess Harris, who is a PhD and JD and a professor of American Studies and Political Science at Macalester College. She's also a scholar of contemporary African American history and political theory. Duchess, as she prefers to be called, has published many books and articles. And what I found very impressive is that she wrote a book about her grandmother's experience. It's called Hidden Human Computers, The Black Women of NASA. And she also, so she's talked about the grandmothers, and she's also the curator of the Duchess Harris collection, which is 115 books for students in grades 4 to 12. She has also contributed to the Huffington Post on race, feminism, and politics. We're going to ask that you hold your questions until the end of her presentation, and then you'll be able to raise your hand either this way or by raising the hand, and she will answer questions. So Professor Harris, or Duchess as you prefer to be called, we are ready to learn much more from you, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so glad that I was invited to your group. I know the League of Women Voters has different chapters in different parts of Minnesota, and I haven't spoken to the Edina group before. So this is a pleasure. What I'm going to do today is talk to you about what I consider to kind of be my signature academic book. So when you're an academic, you kind of establish your identity in different ways. And this was my first big book, I would say. And I started writing this book. It's come out in 3 editions. And the first edition, the title of it was Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Clinton. And it was doing an overview of Black women's political participation from John F. Kennedy's administration up to Bill Clinton's administration. And when I talk about politics, I talk about politics broadly. So I'm not just talking about electoral politics. I'm also talking about political appointments and other ways in which Black women are situated to, influence the sphere of power related to government. I updated the book when Obama was elected and did a second edition halfway through his presidency, actually, I think like halfway through his first term. And then when Trump was elected, I kind of rounded things out by talking about all 8 years of Obama and then the first 2 years of Trump. And so today I want to kind of update somewhat and talk about what it means that the Vice President of the United States is a woman of color who is of Indian and Jamaican descent, Kamala Harris, and what the journey was for Black women to kind of get in that kind of role and position. And so I like the fact that this is a small group. You're actually smaller than the class that I'm teaching this module. So I feel like it'll be easy to interact. I have slides, I have a YouTube clip, but I might stop sharing screen periodically just so we can see each other. So I'm gonna share the screen now and take you to my slides here. Let's see. There we go. And so this is the jacket cover of my book, Black Feminist Politics from Kennedy to Trump. And for today's talk, I'm also going to talk about Kamala Harris somewhat, a little bit about my career. The most recent thing that's happened is that I've been asked to be on the Kamala Harris Project Advisory Board. which is coming out of the University of Southern California. They're the ones that have gotten this multi-million-dollar grant, and we are working on a research project to talk about her first 100 days. And we'll be having a symposium on May 7th, which will be open to the public. And I can stay in touch with you, Colleen, and make sure that I share the link. So if people want to see that, they can. And so I'm going to open up with how challenging the Trump administration was for many Black women in office. And just so you know, I have my own political leanings, but the book isn't really a partisan book, because what you'll find from my talk is that you'll see that unfortunately, Black women faced many challenges from Democrats as well. But one of the elected officials who really pushed back during the Trump administration was Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And so I just want to open up the talk with this brief 2-minute clip that I have of her when she's in a judicial hearing. It's 2017. Steve Mnuchin is kind of challenging how he's going to address her. And she's resistant with that, with her claim that he is trying to usurp her time and that she's going to reclaim her time. And so I'll just share that with you all here. I'll switch up. Here we go. So my students laugh at me because the younger generation is a lot more facile with this than I am. And I am like, bear with me. I'm doing the best I can. So here we are.
I was going to answer that.
Just please go straight to the answer.
Mr. Chairman, I thought when you read the rules, you acknowledged that I shouldn't be interrupted and that I would have
reclaiming my time. What he failed to tell you was when you're on my time, I can reclaim it. He left that out, so I'm reclaiming my time. Please, will you respond to the question of why I did not get a response, me and my colleagues, to the May 23rd letter?
Well, I was going to tell you my response.
Just tell me.
Okay, so first of all, let me just say that the Department of Treasury has cooperated extensively with the Senate Intel Committee, with the House
reclaiming
Intel
my
Committee,
time,
with the
reclaiming my
Senate
time,
Judiciary
reclaiming
Committee.
my time,
Okay,
reclaiming
matter of
my
fact,
time.
Mr. Secretary, the time belongs to the gentlelady from California.
perhaps, Mr. Chairman, I don't understand the rules because I
Reclaiming
thought I
my
was allowed to
time.
answer questions.
Reclaiming my time. Would you please explain the rules and do not take that away from my time?
We will give the gentlelady adequate time. So what I read, Mr. Secretary, were statements of the ranking member and Democratic colleagues on how administration witnesses should be treated, not necessarily the way they will be treated. So the time belongs to the gentlelady from California, but I assure you majority members will allow you to answer the question when it is our time.
Okay, so what I was saying is that we have provided substantial information. We believe there's significant overlap. And matter of fact, I would say that we spoke to your Chief Oversight Council yesterday. We have been responsive and we are trying to coordinate with you the response, and we've suggested that you get the information through the other committees. But I would like to emphasize, we believe we've been very
reclaiming
responsive.
My time.
And we'll
Thank
continue
you
to do
very
so.
much. You left a message yesterday, or someone on staff left a message.
No, we didn't leave a message.
Reclaiming
We
my
spoke to the
time,
Chief
reclaiming my
Oversight
time,
Council.
reclaiming my time. You did not respond. You left a message. Let us keep going.
Okay, so one of the reasons why I wanted to share that is that Congresswoman Maxine Waters has really risen to a level of stature and authority in Congress, that she is in a position where she can actually insist upon the fact that someone like Mnuchin, participate in the system in the way that he should be, and that she is reclaiming her time. I use that as a metaphor for like what the journey has been for Black women to get to a position where they actually can reclaim their time and center themselves in electoral politics. And so if we are going to look at Black women's, journey to getting to this position. I will just share it again. One of the things that I'm arguing in my book is that if you're looking at presidential politics, clearly given the history of the country, they've always struggled with race, class, and gender issues. And so when my book first came out, and it was first published, let's see, I guess it would have been 2008 was when the first edition came out. It actually came out, it went to press before we knew who the next president was going to be. We didn't know if it was going to be, I guess, McCain or Obama. And so when the reviews came out, they said that my analysis was both hopeful and disheartening, which I thought was fair because I think the story of Black women's journeys throughout the political sphere is both hopeful and disheartening. And so originally I was just looking at a 40-year time period. I was going to look at between 1961 and 2001. I like to share this image because undergraduates have no idea who that is. Of course, that is Angela Davis. The next image I'll show with you is an image that a lot of people don't know who this is. And one of my arguments in the book is that Black women do achieve lots of success, but there's a lot of pushback as well. So sometimes success can be fleeting. This is an image of Senator Carol Moseley Braun. She, of course, is the first Black woman to be a United States Senator. The second Black woman who becomes a United States Senator ends up being Kamala Harris. And now that she's vice president, there are no Black women in the Senate. Carol Moseley Braun represented Illinois. She had one term. There was a lot of resistance to her being in the Senate when she ran for re-election, even though Al Gore came out and campaigned for her, and Hillary Rodham Clinton campaigned for her, Bill Clinton campaigned for her. She still lost to a Republican candidate who was a billionaire in his own right and had lots of election money. So one of the things I'm doing in this book is trying to answer the question, what was the political position of Black women in 1963? And one of the reasons why I start off with this question is that I was really inspired by a book that I read as an undergraduate, where Paula Giddings, who was the author, traces Black women's political participation from like the suffrage movement up until around the second wave of feminism. And she stops there, and she stops like with this question of what were Black women doing at this time. And I think it's a fascinating question because it's clear what Black men are doing. Their political agenda is being articulated at the March on Washington. It's a particular kind of Black man, mostly Southern Black men who are Protestant, who are ministers, who are straight. And I say that because Bayard Rustin, who was openly gay, was the strategist for the March on Washington, but they didn't want him on the platform because they thought that the fact that he was gay would detract from sympathy that they might get for their political message. And so it is, clear as to where the Southern civil rights movement is going. In terms of what many white women's agendas are in 1963, that same year, that is when The Feminine Mystique came out. And Betty Friedan provided a platform for middle-class white, that should say women, that's a typo, my apologies, it says men, for middle-class white women who had had some work participation during World War II, as many of us know, but the economy boomed after that in the 1950s. Highways are built and infrastructure set up, suburbia grows. Men who participated in World War II were able to use the GI Bill and to purchase homes. And a lot of middle-class white women are afforded the privilege to stay at home. When you enter the early 1960s, there were some white women who wanted to pursue white-collar careers. And when Betty Friedan writes The Feminine Mystique, she addresses kind of the lethargy that some of them are feeling with addressing the problem that has no name. And I'm sure you all are familiar with her and the work that she does. So Paula Giddings, who I read, asked the question, well, who presented the political agenda for Black women? And so I felt like that gave me a fantastic research question. And so I really end up thinking about two things, which is what were Black women doing to gain political power between 1961 and 2001? Essentially, what were their strategies? And why in many cases was it so difficult for them, and they had a difficult time succeeding. If you know anything about research, you know that you don't go in with a bias. And so it wasn't until after I looked at the attempts and I realized what a struggle it was, then I posed the question, why weren't they succeeding? So my point of departure is John F. Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women, which was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. She actually passed away in 1962, so she didn't see the end of the project. And the commission met from 1961 to 1963. This was significant because this was the first time that a United States president asked the opinions of Black women and actually considered that Black women would have an opinion that might be different from Black men or white women. And so the commission was set up where there were 11 committees, and one committee addressed employment, one committee addressed representations in the media. Then it had like 4 consultative bodies, and the 4th consultation was called Problems of Negro Women. And I always have to explain to young people that, that's not pejorative. As many of you on this call will know, that in the 1960s, African Americans or Black people were referred to as Negroes. And so Problems of Negro Women. And so the good news about this is that, really high ranking Black women, such as, oh my goodness, Dorothy Height, who was a leader in education, were called upon for their opinion. And so that's very important. The challenging news is that none of the suggestions that the Black women made were put into the final report. And so, of course, I go to the archives, I go to the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston, I go and pull up, at the time when I'm doing the research, microfilm and microfiche, because it's pre-internet, to see the New York Times stories. And one of the things that's unfortunate that the Black women's suggestions weren't included is that they had actually conceptualized what we might understand today is AFDC, or Aid for Families and Dependent Children. And one of the things they talked about was that white women often, when they were able to go into the white collar world, would be able to find childcare. Often it might be Black women. For Black women to try to have those options, they often couldn't find people to take care of their children. And so this was like a critical public policy intervention that could have happened, but actually didn't. So if we move forward in the chronology of like Black women still trying to insert themselves in social movements, and I include social movements as a part of the political sphere, 3 years after you get the findings of John F. Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women, you get the beginnings of the Black Panther Party and the National Organization of Women. And so, and these are images of Huey Newton and Gloria Steinem. What's interesting is that Black women struggled to find a place in either of these organizations, partly because they felt like the Panther Party had a lot of patriarchy, and they felt like the National Organization for Women, even though it was inclusive of Black women, sometimes they get a bad rap, but it's not true that Black women weren't included. It's just that they didn't really have working class Black women. It really addressed more affluent Black women. So this had some women think that there should be the beginnings of a national Black feminist organization. And, one of the people that was early on a part of this was Shirley Chisholm, who was elected to Congress in 1968. Of course, the first Black woman to be elected to Congress, and then, ran for president in 1972. And her slogan was unbought and unbossed. Here is an image of her with the opening of the Congressional Black Caucus. And as you can see, she is surrounded by men. And the Congressional Black Caucus actually wasn't supportive of her running for president. Partly because they had their own biases as men. They thought that that was something that a Black man should do. Only two of these men supported her bid for presidency. One was Congressman Ron Dellums, who's from the Bay Area, and then Perrin Mitchell, who's from the Baltimore area. And so I'll take you a little bit as well to the National Organization for Women, where their leadership looked very much like this. Even though Florence Kennedy, for instance, and Margaret Sloan Hunter were a part of the leadership as well. So those women that I just mentioned, Florence Kennedy, who was a big time lawyer in New York, and a lot of people don't know that her most famous client was Billie Holiday, and Margaret Sloan, who was a Black woman who was an editor for Ms. Magazine, decided that the National Black Feminist Organization might be able to speak to their needs and others. Eleanor Holmes Norton is one of the first founders. She's not in Congress at the time, but as we know, she's in Congress now. Alice Walker, the famous novelist, who wasn't a famous novelist at the time, and as I mentioned previously, Shirley Chisholm. So what did the National Black Feminist Organization do? One of the things that they were trying to do was talk about patriarchy in the Black community. Michelle Wallace, who was a young woman at the time in her 20s, said that as a straight woman, this was challenging. In fact, a lot of the women in the National Black Feminist Organization were straight women and felt like, this was too difficult of a task. And so the National Black Feminist Organization had a Boston chapter, and the women in the Boston chapter were queer, and they decided that that gave them more leverage to do some political organizing than the straight women had, because they didn't feel the social pressure. And so this group was called the Combahee River Collective, and they named themselves that so people would say, what is the Combahee River? And they did that as a northern group to tell the story of the South. The Combahee River was in South Carolina, and it was the river where Harriet Tubman would bring people through escaping slavery to go through the river to lose their scent. And so they wanted to take that story with them so that it wouldn't be forgotten and that people would know. If you're outside of academia, something like the Combahee River Collective seems kind of like abstract and esoteric. It's like, well, how important were they? Why haven't I heard of them? What did they do? Actually, the members in the Combahee River Collective, many of them were graduate students who ended up becoming academics. This is important for higher education because they end up bringing the concept of Black women's studies to higher ed. So I'm the youngest in my family. My siblings are 66, 63, 58. I'm almost 52. I am the only one in my family that when I went to college, I could have taken a course on Black women because Alice Walker teaches the first class on Black women's literature in Wesleyan in the middle 1980s by the time my sister, who's 58, was finishing college. And so there's lots of artistic activity that's happening in the 70s and the 80s. And because that's happening, of course, there's going to be pushback. And so conservatives end up really being resistant to the literature that's coming out. People on this call are old enough to remember that when Alice Walker writes The Color Purple, it doesn't just become a big novel, but Steven Spielberg adapts it. It's a movie. And also Into Sake Shange has a play on Broadway called For Colored Girls. All of these artistic endeavors feel like somewhat of a threat to more conservatives. And so Reagan actually ends up coining the phrase welfare queen. A lot of people don't realize that that comes from the Oval Office, which I think has significance. That lexicon did not exist. Those two words next to each other did not exist until Reagan did that. And kind of push that agenda forward so that people would be oppositional to welfare. And his argument was that welfare recipients were disproportionately Black women, which actually is not true. So support for welfare in 1980s, like at an all-time low. More than 80% of America is oppositional to welfare. And part of that is due to the intentionality of Ronald Reagan. I feel like I've been talking for a long time. So I want to kind of stop sharing screen and just provide some dialogue here. So one of the things I do after the 80s is talk about the election of Bill Clinton and how Clinton really has quite an extensive agenda for trying to put Black women in his cabinet, but faces lots of resistance. And I'm not necessarily blaming Clinton for this. It's just the structure of it. People on this call should be able to remember that he wanted to have Lonnie Guinier as his assistant attorney general for civil rights. People were resistant to Guinier. They read her legal writing, which was questioning gerrymandering, and instead reframed it and said that she wanted racial quotas for voting. So she was never able to go before the Senate. Also, the media did, just kind of a campaign against her. If you remember what she looked like, she was mixed race. She had very wiry hair, and the Associated Press said strange hair, strange name for a woman who now is on the faculty of Harvard Law School. Then Clinton was successful for a minute with getting Jocelyn Elders in to be the Surgeon General. But she only had that position for 18 months. Because ironically, this was before Monica Lewinsky. He was upset that she spoke about condom usage at a medical meeting, right? And I always have to emphasize a medical meeting, and also that was in the height of HIV and AIDS. And he thought she was inappropriate. So she lost her position. And so this is like some of the tension, some of the dance that happens throughout presidential politics, regardless of the political party or affiliation. And one of the things I argue in my updated book is that Obama actually doesn't do much better. Desiree Rogers, who is his social secretary, ends up resigning. His domestic policy advisor, Melody Barnes, resigns. He ends up firing Shirley Sherrod, who was a part of the USDA, and realizes the mistake that he makes in firing Shirley Sherrod and tries to rehire her the next day. That doesn't go particularly well. And so, one of the things I'm just outlining is that you get many successes. And then, there are always these setbacks. Loretta Lynch was a success for the Obama administration because she was Attorney General, but it ended up being the longest hearing ever in the United States of America. It took her 5 months to get seated. And then once she got seated, the Obama administration was almost over, which then brings us up to the Trump administration, where the only Black woman that he had in his cabinet was Omarosa, and she resigned and still hasn't explained why. And so it is constantly a story of one step forward, two steps back, to somehow the vice president of the United States is now a Black woman. And so obviously, because of my research, I'm fascinated by this. I have no idea how this story is going to unfold. I promise you, I'm watching it daily when I'm not doing everything else I'm trying to do. And so I thought I would just take this opportunity, since it's a small group, just to open it up so that we can have a conversation. And also, some of this is kind of going down memory lane, because undergrads don't remember any of this. And so it's a pleasure addressing some people who, actually know who Jocelyn Elders is. So with that, I'll just pause and open it and see if you all have any comments. And I didn't even talk about Stacey Abrams, so we can talk about her too. Yeah, Kathy. Oh, sorry.
So I'm fascinated by you've walked us up to all the baby steps forward, huge leaps back, and now all of a sudden Kamala Harris is our VP. What's your, and maybe this is part of your new research and what's going to come out in your new book, and I don't want to make you preview it necessarily for us, but what's your explanation for how all of a sudden there's this gigantic leap,
right,
when we've just been clawing our way along?
Right. Well, there's definitely no new book yet, right? Because we have to live through it. So it's like I'm watching it unfold. And my analysis so far takes us back about 13 months ago, like last March, when you still had all of the contenders, right, on the Democratic side. And in fact, I think many people, if you look back on it, would think that at that moment, Biden was still kind of an underdog. And so if someone had asked me if he was going to rise up to the candidate, I'm not sure I would have put my money there. But Biden meets with Congressman James Clyburn, who is an elder, who is a senior statesman in the Congressional Black Caucus. He is South Carolina. And that was very strategic that Biden understood that that would be a person to go to. And Clyburn gives Biden the blessing. And the voting bloc within the Democratic Party is such that African Americans make up the largest, most consistent voting bloc. It's very different from Latinos who split, right? Latinos will vote Republican. Gay people have had a strong bloc in the Democratic Party, but you still have log cabin Republicans. So the Congressional Black Caucus was like, okay, Biden, we will go with you. But they brokered a deal. And Clyburn said, your running mate's going to have to be a Black woman. And Biden was like, okay, if you pick me, right? Because I think Biden was afraid that they might go with Warren. Like he didn't know, what they were going to do. And he knew that they were going to have the voter turnout and that they were going to, it's called high level political theory. It's called linked fate, which is the concept of all voting together because your fate is together, even if you disagree on different policy issues. Right. And so, like I said, Latinos have not embraced linked fate because they might, take pro-life, right? Given like religious affiliation and say, we might not support the Democrat. Even the Southern Black evangelicals will put that aside and say, we'll vote as a bloc. And so that is what lined it up for it to be a Black woman. How it came to be Kamala, I'm not sure. Because people who do what I do for a living were really wondering if he was going to go with Susan Rice. Mm-hmm. And so Kamala didn't feel like a given. And I'm not quite sure what took him there yet. Hope, and then your name is Block, last name Clark.
Yeah, this is wonderful, Duchess. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so in the 60s, as opposed to the white women's movement, which was primarily focused, or involved with more affluent women. I mean, it seems to me that the Black women at that time really were trying to put forward a social policy agenda that would benefit all working women. I mean, it may have been working class at that time, but now we see with this pandemic how all women are affected. So my question to you is, because you are familiar with the progress that's been made, I mean, what are will there be another Black feminist movement, and will it address those more universal social policy issues?
You know, there is, and it's there. And once again, I'm so humbled by it because it's a cyber movement. And so there are Black women in their 30s who consider themselves kind of like the daughters of the women who did Combahee are now like about 70. So there's this woman named Barbara Smith who actually went on to do city council in Albany, New York. And they have been inspired by that. But this whole notion of cyber organizing is fascinating to me. And so I'm the generation in between the Combahee River Collective and like the cyber feminists. And so I love watching it.
How would I access that that work that group is doing?
I can put something in the chat here. So what comes to mind is that they were calling themselves the Crunk Feminists. But to give you an idea of like how cyber movements work and are so powerful is that a lot of people don't think of Black Lives Matter as a Black feminist movement. But the three founders of Black Lives Matter were Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, who are all 30-something Black women. And it started 9 years ago when George Zimmerman was acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin. They got on Twitter and just started saying, you know, I'm so upset. And then they just did this hashtag, Black Lives Matter. Now, for young people now, when they hear the story, they're like, what's the big deal, right? Because now people are tweeting so much that no one thinks anything of it. That one day, 5 million tweets with the hashtag Black Lives Matter went out. 5 million tweets in a day now is like nothing. But in 2012, nothing like that had ever happened before. So Black Lives Matter started as a cyber movement. It isn't until 2 years later, when Michael Brown is killed in Ferguson, that people said, I'm going to get in my car, I'm going to get on a plane, I'm going to get on a bus, whatever. Then people went to Missouri, and then it was a movement on the ground. But a lot of people that were doing Black Lives Matter hadn't even met each other in person, and there was no pandemic. It was just like, you know, hey, catch you in cyberspace, right? And so a lot of people think of Black Lives Matter as being like this masculine thing because most of the men that have been killed, I mean, most of the people who have been killed have been men, but the organizing actually came from the women, which is the tradition in African-American culture. And so, I mean, I'm intrigued by all of it, right? Because I'm just kind of outside of it that, you know, I'm not someone that was like tweeting in 2012, right? I mean, I'm like grading papers at my liberal arts college in the Midwest, you know, like raising 3 kids, right? And so, you know, the generational differences really are fascinating. Ms. Clark.
You talked about the woman that resigned from Trump's administration, and you said no reason was given. I'm wondering if it's more the press, or they didn't announce it, the Trump administration didn't announce it, or she kept it to herself.
Well, see, I can't believe there isn't a book. So I don't know if you're familiar or not of who Omarosa was, but he found her because she was a media personality. She was one of those, that show that he had about getting your business, whatever that, I can't even remember. It's like, there's so many things that he has done. But she was a big TV personality that was an ally of his. And so he brought her with him. And so it's fascinating that they had a falling out, but she's the only one that he even tried with. Yeah. Like, what was the name of that? The Apprentice. That's what it was. So she became, her name is she became like famous through The Apprentice. And she's very attractive and she's very, you know, she's like a media person.
So I have a quick question.
Sure.
And this is something that's a little bit more local.
Mhm.
Considering the demographic that we have that we have here in Minnesota, obviously, you know, our the makeup of our population, the percentage rather, that is African American is relatively small compared to the overall population. And there are quite a few concerning things that are taking place politically right now, as far as putting restriction on access to voting and things of that nature. And what I am looking at and what I am wondering is how Black women and the Black community as a whole overall can move to, I guess, influence that and to actually like impact that, have some meaningful impact, especially considering how small our population
Right.
is. Like, what is it that we can be doing, you know, that can bring to bear pressure? Because my feeling is that, again, like most of these bills that are being pushed nationwide, and a lot of people didn't really realize it was happening in Minnesota. They look at the sexy states like Georgia and Texas and there, but no, it's happening here too. But that definitely will disproportionately affect, you know, Black and Brown communities and low income communities. So what can we be doing locally to just kind of to create some might and some force around that?
Mhm. I am actually inspired. I had such a wonderful experience 2 days ago. The immediate past president of the Minneapolis NAACP just had her birthday last week. She's 29. She was replaced by someone that I think that's even younger than she is. The talent though, like she's 29, she's a JD MBA. It's like the energy that she has brought to social movements. And I always bring social movements into politics because I think they're relevant. And I also think they're culturally specific because that's how African Americans have always like moved into electoral politics, is like through social movements. I think the work that they're doing is inspiring. I think the Black women elected officials we have are inspiring. Like I follow State Representative Rena Moran from St. Paul. And the work that she does isn't just about St. Paul. And she has been very outspoken about voter suppression stuff. I know that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is really controversial, but I think what's interesting about her is that she reflects the 5th district, right? I always think it's fascinating that people are like, well, she's perceived like this, she's perceived like that. I'm like, there's a reason why she has gotten reelected, and I think that will continue, which is that she reflects that demographic. And that's a population as well that people outside of Minnesota don't realize, that just that neighborhood in Minneapolis has more Somali people than Mogadishu does, right? I saw that documentary. I didn't know that at first. And so I think there's a lot of stuff that's going on. It might not be getting the national news, but it's like if you're paying attention, I see it in different pockets. And I think because we have an immigrant community here, it works out in different communities differently, different generations, and then even different class positions, right? And so I would identify myself as upper middle class. My husband and I both have very good jobs, right? What I think is fascinating, and this has to be the smallest Black upper middle class population I've seen in my entire life. Like I feel like people think like we're unicorns. People just like stare at us. Partly because it's like I've spent a lot of time on the East Coast where, you know, I just blend in DC. No one would even give me the time of day in DC. But what I see white collar Black people doing is fascinating, right? And so I loosely use the word friend with Laisha Ward because we belong to this small Black women's organization. There's only 30 of us. We meet every month. And Laisha Ward is a VP for Target. And you saw that Target just announced that they're going to put $2 billion out to have Black owned businesses have their products in Target, right? I know Laisha well enough because we've been in this org together for like 8 years. She almost like single-handedly probably initiated that. And so I think the different angles at which we get to this, is it through corporations? Is it through foundations, right? Like, is it the kind of work that Shonda Smith Baker is doing through the Minneapolis Foundation with the former mayor of Minneapolis, right? So I think that there's things happening all different kinds of levels. It just depends on how you're looking at it.
Okay.
I mean, I think the stuff that you guys are doing with Medtronic, like I'm friends with Michelle Miller. Like, I know what you guys are doing over there. It's really important work.
Yeah, I'm actually very, very proud. I've been at Medtronic for about 3 years, but I'm extremely proud of the work that they're doing and the work that they've done over this past year around inclusion, diversity, and equity, and really trying to walk the walk, not just talk the talk, and being recognized for that locally and nationally. Very, very, very proud.
And see, that's the invisible work. And so that's why, like, my academic appointment is in both American studies and political science, because political scientists, even in 2021, when you say politics, you hold an elected office. Like, they don't really, that's what they want to talk about, right? And I love them. These are my colleagues, you know, I'm not speaking against that. People who have more interdisciplinary training and also people that really look at particular communities understand the fact that I think the invisible work that some people that don't see what's happening in Medtronic, I think that that's political, right? If I can get some students of color to get internships at Medtronic and possibly get a job at Medtronic, given the wealth gap, that to me is apolitic. And so I look at politics like broadly, you know. I think what Target is doing is apolitic.
Yep. Good.
Yeah, Julie.
I'm curious. You say you went to Wesleyan. Is that correct?
No, that's where Alice Walker taught the first course on Black women's literature.
Okay.
It was at Wesleyan. It was around the time I went to college. I went to the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And I'm proud to say, I realize now at this point in my life why I ended up doing what I do now, is that my academic advisor was Mary Frances Berry. And she was on Carter's Civil Rights Commission, and then she wasn't reappointed by Reagan, and then she sued Reagan, and then she got reappointed. And I mean, she was fascinating because she would take the Amtrak train. She would like teach us in Philly, and then she'd go to DC. And she was the first Black woman I met that had a JD PhD. And even though I'm third generation college educated, which is a big deal for Black people, that was unimaginable to me until I met her. And so I swear it had to have only been like 5 years ago before I realized that I was trying to be her when I grew up. I didn't even realize it. This is how moms feel, like when their kids do exactly what they're doing, but like swear their whole lives they're not going to be like them.
Yeah. My question for you, Duchess, is I'm very committed to young people. We have a youth board member and we have youth memberships in the League of Women Voters. And I mentioned Wesleyan because my son went to Wesleyan, and I think there's a different pulse or different awareness in a small environment, probably aligning with the college that you're at, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the trends you're seeing that relate to some of the things we've been talking, trends in college and in high school? What are some of the things for us to be aware of?
I think that like the students at Macalester, you all know, are very, very political. So it doesn't take much for a Mac kid to take to the streets. And so what's interesting is that they do it both ways. They do both social movement stuff and electoral stuff because we're so close to the Capitol. And my colleague, Julie Dolan, teaches this legislative politics class where every student in the class is a legislative intern. And so all of that is happening at the same time. I just love it. I think it's fun. It's an interesting job. And I've actually been there long enough that now, like, my former students are leading the internships. Like they're the mentors now. And so that's a lot of fun. Yeah, Joni.
So I think a lot of us, or most of us, would see the electoral success in Georgia as definitely a product of the work of Black women.
Yeah.
Can that energy continue in the face of so many efforts to suppress the vote in so many states? What are your predictions or hopes for that movement and its impact?
I am so excited about that movement. And you were right. It has everything to do with not just Black women's leadership, but there's a particular thing with like Southern Black women's leadership that I've been trying to help my students at McAllister understand. We don't have a lot of Southern students of any racial background. And also, a lot of McAllister students disidentify from the church. And so me trying to explain to them that when Senator Warnock got that position, like what it meant that he was a pastor and that like he's from Martin Luther King's church. And so Black women's, political, right? Because it's not elected. So some people are like, how's this political, right? But political organizing has been a grassroots church-based thing since before Rosa Parks. Like that has been what Black women have done. And so if you link it to someone like Rosa Parks, one of the reasons why we won the bus boycott was that they were strategic. They started it in December of 55. It goes until December of 56. Am I being granular? Nope, the December really matters. Black people didn't shop in Montgomery for 2 Christmas seasons. That impacted the economy. Black people knew exactly what they were doing. Okay. And so then it's like, how did the church women keep the organizing going? The church women were mostly domestics, right? That's my dad's side of the family. That grandmother was a domestic. My other grandmother worked for NASA, right? Which was an elite privilege thing. What did those Black women do? They said, not gonna clean your house if you don't come pick me up in your car. And we don't have that much money anyway, like we'll go without. We'll eat. And so, and there's like there's like a Hollywood movie out there that I can't remember who's in it. Maybe Sissy Spacek, I don't know. But it's called The Long Walk Home. And I think with Whoopi Goldberg, right? And so a lot of people don't realize that it's like white women felt pressed that they didn't want to do everything that they weren't used to doing, particularly since we didn't have the technology back then. So I have to explain to students, like, people didn't have dishwashers in 1954, like people didn't have clothes dryers in 1954, irons didn't have plugs maybe, right? So I'm trying to like walk students through this. And so the husbands went to work and the white women like waited like an hour just to make sure things like all settled down. And then they got in their car, picked up their maids, had their maids do their work, looked at the clock, and they were like, I don't want to risk getting caught. You don't have to work as long as usual, and would drive them back home. But that is like Black women's like grassroots organizing that has been going on the whole time. And so that's the tradition that Stacey Abrams comes out of. And the church politics, all of that, I think that movement has been revitalized. I think it was also a very nice kind of like sneaky collaboration between Black women and white women. Like I think that was like a hidden allyship that most people don't know about. Like, did you all know about that? I'm like profoundly amused by that. Like, because I feel like that was a way that white women were empowering themselves, that they were like, I'm not going to do all this housework and take care of all these kids by myself. I don't care if my husband, is for segregation. I'm going to subvert this.
And the Rosa Parks Museum at Troy State University does also show that the community itself organized shuttles, station wagons, and just kept the community.
Definitely. And it's like, who thought of that? Black women. And it was partly because the men wanted to be out front, like let's say the March on Washington, right? A lot of people wanted a king out front, and the Black women were like, that is cool. Watch what we will do behind the scenes.
It's funny to build on that tradition just a little bit. When you were talking about your family, and then also talking about shuttling, my grandmother on my father's side, she was born in Oklahoma, was orphaned, went to a DB&O school, which was deaf, blind, and orphan school. Didn't have much education, married my grandfather and moved here. And she worked cleaning people's houses. And that's what she did. But every, I'd say, probably 4 or 5 years, my grandpa would buy her a station wagon. And that was the car she always got. It was a station wagon. And every Sunday, she would pick me up for church. And then we would start the rounds. We would stop at all her little friends' house and pick them all up. And it would take us probably about 45 minutes to an hour before we actually made it to church. But the car would be packed from the front to the back. And she would do that for prayer meetings. She would do that. They would go grocery shopping, because a lot of the women didn't have vehicles then. But it's just kind of keeping that tradition going. So I got a chance to see some of that firsthand. And it was always very annoying to me, because I was the first person to get picked up, and I had to sit in the car with all these old Black women and listen to them talk about, and a lot of them clean people's houses out in St. Louis Park and Wayzata, and talk about, what was going on at work. And I'd just be like, oh my God. But now I see it, and I'm like, I've encouraged people, like my mother is retired and she lives in Tennessee. And one of the things that I encouraged her to do over the last couple of election cycles is to utilize her car like grandma did. Pick these people up, because they don't have public transportation out in rural Tennessee. Pick these people up, take them to the polls, take them to get registered. And so she's been actively participating in that, but it's just interesting to see how that tradition has carried forward.
Yeah, I love that, because a lot of people were so surprised at what the voter turnout was the first time Obama ran for president. And to me, it came straight out of that whole like transportation playbook, right, that you're talking about. And it's like, that is a tradition that some people might not be familiar with, but it's been around for, 60 years. So I love that story. That's a great story. So in the chat, we have no longer wanting to be subversive today. Where should white women support, place, etc. be today? So Katie, and where's Katie? I'm looking to my screen here. Oh, okay, your picture's not up. Oh, there you are. Hey, can you unmute?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you be more specific with the question?
Well, in the sense that finding the right place, there's a history of white women coming in and saying, okay, we'll take over whenever they join other groups, and supporting. And so what does, in 2021, 22, what does white women's support look like, or should look like, in terms of not overstepping, overreaching, and making the mistakes of our format, like the 1970s, the women's movement back in the 70s, not making those same mistakes because of our blindness.
Yeah, I love that question. I do a lot of work with nonprofit boards, and one of the things that we talk about is asking communities, what do you need, right? Which is so different from, I have a package of school supplies, right? With very well-intentioned, right? And it's like, maybe people need that. And I think one of the people that's so good at this is the CEO of the St. Paul Y is a woman named Gay Massey Adams. actually Gay Adams Massey, sorry. And she has a fantastic board, and they operate in this way because they try to, you know, be accountable to the community that they're in St. Paul. And most of them, you know, don't live in that community. But just asking the question, what do you need? Because we often are surprised, right? We're often surprised.
Yeah.
And I was trying to think of something concrete, and I'll try to, oh, we're probably like at time right now. I'm just trying to think of like, you know, a surprise that I've had. And I've been like, and I never would have realized that, you know, people might want this. And are we at time, Colleen?
I think I mean, you certainly can go on. We don't have a cutoff time. I believe you usually like it to go until the questions are answered, correct?
Okay, well, I've blocked out time, so I'm good. And I see Hope has a question, so.
Yeah, so this is for you as a political scientist, but also with your historical perspective on movements. The pandemic has ripped away the mask on this society. And so my question is, what are the chances, your take on what are the chances that we will be able to come together across class and across race to mount a big enough movement to really bring about the kinds of universal policies? And I'm talking family policy, daycare, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Transportation, healthcare, education, you know, those basic human universal needs to lead a dignified life. What are the chances that we can do that now? And what is your take on the role that women might play in helping that to succeed? It's kind of Katie's question, but maybe in a little.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me now, you know, as the generations are shifting, young girls don't seem to see the impediments that others of us might have seen, right? So I have 3 kids, and my daughter is 17. She doesn't really see a whole lot of obstacles that are like related to gender, right? I mean, there's some things she might say like, oh, I don't want to do this. And it might be, you know, that doesn't really interest me, but it's not the like, I can't, right? Which is a very different thing. I think organizing along race for people with some educational and some class privilege is pretty successful. I think bringing working class people together across race, that's our challenge. That's our challenge. And, you know, I don't have a lot of solution for that. Like a perfect example is the book Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah.
Right. Which also now, you know, the Netflix movie came out, but, you know, many of us read it, you know, New York Times bestseller. And that's what his argument is. His argument, he admitted that the people from his town, and he implicated himself in this, were resentful of Obama, right? And he said, you know, people would want to say it's because he's Black. He's like, but really, it's because he's cosmopolitan. It's really because he went to Columbia and Harvard. It's the suits he wears. It's how he speaks. It's how he, you know, the way he pronounces words. And so that kind of divide, I think, is a challenge, right? I think it's much more of a challenge for working class whites and working class Blacks to find a commonality, right? Like, I can't speak for LaVon, but, you know, how I hope she's treated at Medtronic, how I'm treated at McAllister, that's like a different thing, right? That doesn't mean that I haven't had my tense moments at McAllister, but for all intents and purposes, it's like, They want a product. I have the product, right? They're good with that. Right. But I mean, I'm also, you know, there isn't a lot of resentment that I'm there. There aren't many of me. But it's a very different thing.
At the Bessemer attempt to unionize now, in Bessemer, Alabama, is that led by, that's largely Black workers?
I think so. I haven't looked at it closely. And my dad's family was from an area that was so rural. They would say we're from near Bessemer because they weren't even from Bessemer.
Yeah.
And see that I love that example. That's the challenge,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
When you get that to be multiracial, that is some progress that, as much as I trace history, that I've never seen before, right? But think about just kind of like a Biden coalition. Well, you know, you're gonna have some people of color in that, like the head of the DNC now. I can't think of her last name, but I mean, I know their family. I mean, they're elite Black people.
Yeah.
Right. So for elite whites and elite Blacks to come together, sure. Like, that's cool. That's kind of like what the Combined River Collective was saying. They were like, the National Black Feminist Organization, like, that's cool for Eleanor Holmes Norton, but like, we're not her.
Right.
Right.
Right. Thank you.
Colleen and then LaVon.
Yes, I have a question on this, the working class. And I lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years, just about. And I wonder, is there a way to get the working class Black males involved with the working class Black females to kind of make this? I think sometimes that the working class whites say, well, you know, it's just the women, or you know, we worry about the Black men, whatever. Is there a way to kind of pull that together more?
I mean, there would be if we didn't have such high incarceration rates.
Yeah.
So that's what the problem is. So I had a discussion with some of my colleagues in the English department, and this kind of blew their heads off. Because I said to them, is there another ethnic group that has a genre in literature dedicated to prison other than Black people? And they were like, okay, we're done. Like, don't come back to any more of our meetings. Like, they were like, they couldn't even process it, right? Because I was like, listen, you can teach a 14-week class on Black prison literature. You know this is true. Right? I was like, you know, this is true. I was like, the syllabi are online. I'm like, can you do that with Asians? Can you do that with Latinos? Can you do that with Indigenous people? I'm like, we have an entire body of work that is now called Critical Prison Studies that is predominantly about Black people. And so that whole notion of the working class does leave the Black working class to be mostly female. LaVon.
Sorry, I had to unmute there. And I wanted to go back to, I think it was kind of what Hope was saying, and then also, so when we talk about the working class and looking at getting folks to come together across race, I wonder how much of it is a lack of understanding of how race was set up in this country as it wasn't really racial. It had to do with wealth and maintaining affluence. And so if you can get the folks that are less affluent to fight amongst each other over crumbs and scraps, then they're not paying attention and they're not attacking the folks at the top. And I wonder how we can go about kind of addressing that issue amongst the working class. I think that would go a long way towards breaking down some of those barriers to seeing that we literally are being pitted to a certain extent against each other, because if we do get together, the amount of force and power that we have to affect change is unstoppable.
Yeah, this is great. So you all might be surprised by my answer. So I did my postdoc at this research center in Minnesota Law School that now has a different focus. But when I was there, it was called the Institute on Race and Poverty. And I see Hope nodding her head. That was John Powell when he lived in town. And so what I learned is that this is a geography lesson. Now I'm sure you all like, where's this lady going with this? If we stay like in the North, to answer this question, it plays out differently in the South. But if we stay in the North, white poverty is usually rural. Black poverty is urban. And so when you're trying to get organizing, the experiences are profoundly different, so the people cannot relate to each other. So Black people have farms in the South, and that's what I'm saying. I'm going to talk about it regionally first, right? Black people do have farms in the South. Black people don't have farms in Minnesota, right? I know that sounds like, oh, you're going to be like, it's a gross generalization. I know like these 3 families, okay? That's awesome, right? For the most part, we all know there aren't any Black farms in Minnesota, but you have North Minneapolis in Minnesota, where there are not a lot of white people over there. And so what happens with that is that people on farms are suffering. People in North Minneapolis are suffering. They're suffering differently, and therefore they don't know how to bring together a coalition. That is part of what the problem is.
I didn't think about the geography.
See what I'm saying? I mean,
Yeah.
it's like, it's a miracle what happens when they make you like read all these books, right? Because I was like, I didn't go to grad school to study geography. And, and it was like, it must have been like 96 where geographical information systems was kind of being invented, because like the internet then wasn't what it is now. Now they have something called GIS mapping, which we do at McAllister. You can get expertise in, da, da, da. And so we were starting to think about this thing called opportunity maps, where you look on the map and see where the opportunities are. And so, you know, maybe there are not a lot of opportunities in Wilmer, right? Or maybe there are not a lot of opportunities in certain spaces. But people in urban spaces often do not have a lot of compassion. They're not thinking about what's going on in Wilmer. They don't care, right? And people in the rural spaces are thinking, why don't those Black people just stop shooting each other, right? And so that's where the breakdown is. In the South, it plays out a little differently because Black people in the South are rural as well. But the history of segregation makes it such that some places are still fighting the Civil War in the South. And people think I'm being like sarcastic when I'm saying that. But if you spent any time down there, like people in Bessemer are still talking about the Blues and the Grays. And so that's partly what keeps a coalition not happening. I'm just curious, what do some other people think about that?
I have a somewhat related question, which is
Sure, yeah.
Charles Blow, the columnist.
I love him. He's my
called-
pretend boyfriend. Don't tell my husband.
He's called for this reverse Great Migration. And I am curious but worried about what that means for some of the things that we've been talking about today. I see what he's calling for in this concentration of power, building of power, but what are your thoughts on that?
To me, that's just personal choice. I mean, one of the reasons why I understand the appeal for some people is there's so little resources for, I'll just say like Black people like me, right? That that can be frustrating. Whereas if you're in the South, there's so many different options. So just like, okay, so this is like a funny story where I say like, you know, Black people like me, it can be really expensive for Black women to get their hair done, right? Because it requires all kind of extra whatever. And so when the Chauvin trial opened up and the opening statements were made by prosecutor Jerry Blackwell, I was telling some of my girlfriends out of state, I was like, my whole family goes to the salon that his wife owns, right? Which my friends from out of state were like, but of course, because you live in Minnesota, right? But like in Atlanta, men can go to like the barbershop, women can go to the beauty salon, and there isn't like really one place that you would go if you can afford to get your hair done, right? Like that is like ridiculous. Black women's organizations, like people talk about Kamala Harris being Alpha Kappa Alpha. I'm in another Black women's sorority. All of those things in Minnesota have one chapter. Like if you are a white collar professional, places like DC and Atlanta and Philadelphia feel a lot more appealing, right? Like I know people that drive an hour to go to church. Because if you move to Eden Prairie, if you want to go to Black church, that's at least 40 minutes. So I think that's what the migration pull is. It's like, then you can just go and like have options. And Levon, do I have like a witness on any of that? I'm talking about, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about.
The hair piece, I finally gave up on that. I went to dreads and then I cut them off and went natural.
Right, because there's no reason in the world, in the world why you should have to carve out possibly 90 minutes just for driving time round trip to get your hair done.
And,
like,
and sit in the salon for 5 hours because they're so overbooked. Because so that's
crazy, right? But if you work at a place like Medtronic, right, or if I'm doing something for McAllister, they're expecting you to look professional. And it was Representative Rena Moran, who was recently, as 18 months ago, I think, got the Crown Act passed in Minnesota so that you couldn't be fired for having natural hair. So that's something that like a lot of white people don't know. They're like, why are Black women like so obsessed with their hair? And why do they put so much money in their hair? Because you used to could be terminated from your job. And particularly if you had a highly compensating job, it would be very easy for your boss to say, like, you're not going to have that style up in here. But those are the styles that are easiest for us.
Yeah. I can definitely
drive 45 minutes to go to church. In the winter in Minnesota, I am not feeling that like at all. And I have relatives that think that I'm going to burn in hell. And I'm like, well, I'm weighing my options on this one because it's 20 below and I'm really not thinking about driving 45 minutes. Like I'm going to find the Lord online. And when we got to COVID, I was like, look at there, the Lord's everywhere. I'm good. Yeah, I have cousins that like think that I have no hope, but it is what it is. They all live walking distance from churches. Well, this has been fun. I'm so glad you all had me. This has been fantastic.
This is great. Thank you so much, Duchess.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much. And I loved your mention of John Powell. It brought me back to my law school days at the University of Minnesota. I had him for a professor.
He's so nice. He was really nice.
I think what he's doing with the Othering and Belonging Institute is really interesting.
And when is he going to stop working? All that energy. Yeah. I'm like, what?
May he continue, huh?
Exactly. I'm just trying to keep my nutrition up so I can last as long as he has.
Say, Duchess, I have a quick question. And I feel like I'm behind in some of this, just because I've been just distracted with life and whatnot. But somebody recently came across my path, especially within this last year, and her name is Brittany Cooper. And I'm wondering what are your thoughts on I'm dipping my toe in the water. I'm liking what I'm seeing. I'm liking what I'm hearing.
I love her. I had her at McAllister a few years ago. She is just absolute fire. She's actually one of those cyber feminists I was talking about. She was the one that came up with the idea of that kind of cyber collective. She's awesome. Yeah.
I thought about her as soon as you started talking about cyber feminism. I was like, that sounds like Brittany.
Yeah, she's definitely someone to follow. So I put in the chat if anyone wants to reach out to me. My email is Harris@McAllister. And then my webpage is duchessharris.com. And that just has like a whole bunch of videos of me talking about a whole bunch of different things. And some of my like writings and all that stuff too.
Duchess, did you have also a website for the, what are they called? Trump feminists, that group you?
The Crunk feminine, you know, I'm gonna put Brittany Cooper's info in here because you should just know who she is.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Let's see. Let's see. All right, it was just taking me
Colleen, you're muted.
a minute
Yeah,
here.
I actually recognize that geography distinction from having lived in DC. We lived right in the district, and living in Minnesota, in Edina. There's quite a change. And admittedly, I was there, 20 some years ago, but it was quite a difference. And what I see occurring in Edina, especially in the schools and so forth, I think it's something that is overdue and probably sometimes problematic and also very welcoming. So, hopefully we can continue on making a better place for everyone.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, it's really about neighborhoods. People often don't think of it that way, but I mean, it's about neighborhoods or even, regions.
yes, exactly. So with that, I think, anyone have any final comments? Just thank you.
All
Just
right.
Very
Oh,
appreciative.
sign
Thank
off.
you.
Yeah, I realized the president of McAllister wants me to call her, so I should probably go. So, goodbye.
Thank